All right, folks, we'll give it another minute or so and get started. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're really excited to welcome you to today's Physician Scientist 101 for community college students. My name is Bree Christopher, pronoun she. I am a fifth year MD PhD student, and I serve as co-chair of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, JEDI, for the American Physician Scientists Association, APSA. And we're glad to be reprising this event. We did it once last year, and we're hoping that people will get a lot out of it, as folks did the last time we did it. The goal today is for y'all to learn a little bit more about what it could be like to be a physician scientist, how you can do research and practice medicine, or do any combination of those two. And then we'll have our wonderful panelists talk to you about their experiences and why they decided to go down this path. Yeah, cool. Feel free to put any questions or thoughts in either the Q&A box option or in the chat. We'll be looking at both throughout the next hour. And starting at 7, there'll be kind of a subsequent session that's more general audience that'll feature people who are currently like practicing physician scientists and doing all sorts of things in their careers. So highly recommend that you stay on for that if you're able to. Okay, so first off, I'm going to share my screen here. Great. So I'm going to talk for a couple minutes on, why being a physician scientist is awesome and how you can become one. So again, this is to give you context about the many things that physician scientists can do, and things that you could do too. So what is a physician scientist? Physician scientists combine the roles of being a physician and a scientist. And we're defining scientists really broadly, right? These are people who do research. And we'll talk about some fields in a moment, but being a physician scientist, you can do any combination of things that use your training, either medical training or research training. So this could look like treating patients in the clinic, at the hospital. You could lead your own research lab, run clinical trials with patients. There can be a component of mentoring or teaching, be it medical students or graduate students, residents. And, something else that some folks do is kind of go into industry or develop medications, treatments, devices, come up with other ways that we can improve kind of the medical sphere. And this is not an all-inclusive list, right? People are finding many different ways to use their training to make the world better and serve patients better. As far as like logistics goes or becoming a physician scientist, there's not one way to do it. You could get a single degree, so do an MD or a DO, or you can decide to do a dual degree program. So one example of that is doing an MD PhD or a DO PhD. And like I said, being a scientist is really broad, right? You could do research in something that's more of kind of the traditional basic sciences, cell biology, neuroscience, cancer research. Then there's folks who are in the social sciences doing things like anthropology or epidemiology, public health. And And then other folks who their kind of sphere of expertise is more in the clinical or translational science space. So how do we make treatment better? How do we get these things into the clinic and work, directly with patients? Next. So I'll focus a bit on what it's like to do an MD PhD or a DO PhD, just because I think that's a topic that's a little more unfamiliar to folks. But like I said, you could do an MD or DO and combine that with doing research in a variety of ways. But an MD PhD or a DO PhD, pursuing that, it could be done through a formalized program where you complete both degrees. And why would you want to do something that's going to take a really long time? And we'll talk a minute about what that could look like as far as timing. But it gives you a special opportunity to get rigorous medical and research training and apply those things to your ultimate career as a physician scientist. So to give you a sense of like what this path could look like, if starting off in community colleges, depending on how many years you're there, eventually you could transfer to a four-year institution, finish your undergraduate training. You may or may not choose to take other years in between before starting a program. So on average, MD PhD or DO PhD programs take about 8 years. Some people it's a little less, some people it's a little more. It just depends on how your research goes and the rest of the things you have to complete for both degrees. And there's no kind of one size fits all approach to this, right? There's multiple ways or multiple orders that you can do some of the training before doing a dual degree. And as I mentioned, you could decide to do the single degree and still pursue research as part of your career by getting that training during medical school or as a resident physician after you finish training, and ultimately have that as your career. Although getting that research training, you usually will have to spend about the same amount of time, even if you decide to do a 4-year clinical degree, by getting your research training during residency or fellowship or while you're a practicing physician. So if you're daunted by kind of the long, the long path, there's everything gets done in whatever way you want it to happen. So something to consider. When we think about maybe not pros and cons, but just considerations that you should have when deciding, what path to do. If you go the single degree route and choose to do research, there is that shorter clinical training time up front, and you would go straight into clinical training into residency if that's what you wanted to do. Some caveats, right? Research training time is not as well defined as if you decide to do a PhD, go to graduate school in the middle. You still have to pay for medical school somehow. So there's the loans consideration there to pay for that training. And on the other hand, if you decide to do an MD PhD or a DO PhD, for the most part, your training is covered financially, be it tuition, fees, insurance, stipend. Depends where you end up, what combination of those things you receive. You get kind of specified rigorous training in research during those PhD years. And some people consider it to be more competitive if you want to pursue research moving forward, kind of in your postgraduate career. Although, again, it depends what field you end up in and what kind of research you want to be doing. And as as I already said, it can take a while to finish the actual training program. Some people may choose to use one of their kind of the scope of one of their degrees more than the other, or completely one versus the other. And it can be a challenge to constantly be flipping between different modes of learning, right, from medical school to doing your PhD and then coming back to finish medical school, which is the timeline I think that most programs go by at this point. As far as getting involved in research now, before applying or pursuing an MD PhD, it's always a good idea to get started as early as you can, and that can look a variety of ways. You could try to find someone at nearby institutions to work with, or try to do a summer research program. APSA has some resources for finding out about those kinds of opportunities, in addition to running its own virtual summer research program, which community college students qualify for. So there's that. You might decide to take time after graduation and do research at that point. So again, different ways depending on what your goals are and what your life looks like. Just like a brief note about logistics, you can learn a lot more about applying to med school or MD PhD programs through APSA's interactive series sessions, which like very much focus on that part. But just so you have a sense, it's a very similar process to applying to medical school. There's it's the same application if you're applying to MD programs or DO programs for DO PhD programs. But one of the big things that you have to emphasize is your research experience and why you want to move forward training as a physician scientist, and articulating that throughout the application. As far as the other requirements, they're fairly similar. There's a lot of courses that you have to check off as prerequisites, completing the MCAT standardized exam, in addition to other kind of extracurricular activities, and having people talk about why you should be a physician or a physician scientist. That's enough from me, because the more important part of this event is hearing from folks who started off where you are. And we're very grateful for our three panelists today, Danielle, Britt, and Anthony. And this is y'all's time to talk about your experiences and answer questions from folks in the audience about what this path has looked like for you. And I'll leave it up to you guys to introduce yourself however you see fit, but why don't we start with Danielle? Let me stop sharing, sorry.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and the slides are great. I think they're really helpful. So my name is Danielle Sawyer. I am a fourth year MD PhD at the University of Arizona. I don't know if I should introduce more, but I went to community college at Santa Rosa Junior College for about 5 years, attended 2 years at university, and then took 2 gap years before being accepted into MD PhD program here.
I guess I can go next.
Great, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Danielle is my classmate. We're in the same cohort at the University of Arizona, which I think is really cool. We bounce a lot of ideas off each other and have written articles about like being community college alums and such. So yeah, my name is Britt. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm in the neuroscience program at the University of Arizona. So I was also in community college for I think 5 years total. I was like a joint student for a while between Portland Community College and Portland State University. So actually started organic chemistry at the university, and then was like, oh no, I don't like this, and then took it at my community college and then passed the ACS, and then it transferred as university credit. So there's all kinds of ways to like kind of check all the boxes you have to check. So after I graduated, I think I took 2.5 to 3 years as gap years, worked in a research lab, and kind of like convinced myself that like, yes, research is something that I really love, and that no matter like all the bad things that come with it, like the good things outweigh them. So like it was a really good experience. So I managed a lab for about 2 years. And then I got into medical school my second try, so I'm a reapplicant too. So I'm happy to talk to people. I'll put my email in the chat. Like I'm happy to talk to people about reapplying and how to kind of show schools that like you put in an effort to like be super duper after like getting rejected. I think that's it.
Anthony, it's all you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony. I use he, him pronouns. I am a third year MD PhD student at Stony Brook University out on Long Island. And my PhD is going to be in biomedical engineering. I did 2 years at community college. I transferred for 2 years, and then I did 2 years at of gap research before joining the program here. So this is the first time I've done something in a 3-year chunk, which is a new feeling.
Great. Why don't we start off with you all talking about, when did you find out that doing this sort of program or going on this path was a thing, and how it informed your like educational path?
Yeah, so I didn't even know MD PhD programs were a thing until I basically had an opportunity to work with a researcher at a local institution. It was a private research institution near my community college, and a few students every year were selected for this opportunity to kind of gain some research, which is really unique for community colleges. A lot of community colleges don't have access to research opportunities. And in working at this research center, the postdoc that I worked with, said, hey, I know you're all about, going to medical school, and that's great, but, you really like science. Like, he could tell it was just so genuine for me. And I just loved, doing research and being in the lab and answering these questions. It's like, they do have MD, PhD programs, and kind of introduced me to the idea of the program. When I transferred to Davis, I kept doing research, just thinking like, oh, do I really love it? Or maybe it's just that one experience was fantastic. And, I'm not going to like other experiences because, can't all be this great. And I continued to just enjoy, doing research and answering these really cool questions. And I actually was met with a lot of pushback from faculty and professors that were PhDs saying, you can't do it all. You can't, have two really, really, I guess, massive careers and be successful at both. And, so I was really unsure and really hesitant. And, but I said, you know what, there's no harm in like, applying and just, seeing how it goes and seeing if it's a good fit for me. So that's kind of what led me to my decision to apply to MD PhD programs. I really did want to continue research, but also was so interested in helping patients and working directly with patients. I think it's such a privilege to be able to do that too. So that's what brought me here.
I don't have much of a cool story like that. I think I was in the middle of enrolling for university, like as a co-enrolled student at community college, and then I like found out on the website of a med school that there was something called an MD PhD program, and like from the time that I started community college, I thought I always had to choose, and I really liked science, but I really wanted to go to med school, so like I was always kind of debating with myself, like which one do I want to do, like which one I'll be happy doing, and I could never figure it out. And then I found out there were programs that did both, so I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. So that's what kind of steered me towards it. Like at that midway point, like after maybe 2 years of community college, when I discovered it, and I was like, that sounds like exactly what I want to do. Like I want to be a PI, but I also want to see patients. So like that's kind of my goal still. Yeah, and there are a lot of people. There's kind of like a weird. It's almost, I don't want to call it a stigma, but it kind of is. Where like from the MD side, they kind of like have a weird attitude about PhDs, and on the PhD side, they have a weird attitude about MDs, and so like you kind of get the worst of both. Then you're both. But it's really fulfilling to kind of occupy both those spaces. So I'm happy dealing with that kind of stuff. So yeah.
I would say I wandered around for a bit. So for background, I was homeschooled K through 12. And I wasn't really sure if I was going to like being in a classroom. So that's kind of why I started off at community college, because it was very near my parents, and it was like, let's see if, higher education is something that is going to mesh well here. And I really didn't like biology going in. I thought I wanted to do computer science. And what happened was there was a very strong nursing program at my community college, and I wound up taking bio classes that were more human anatomy than actual bio to fulfill my credits, because I just really didn't want to go back to cell bio. And one of the professors there who was teaching was very encouraging that, if you continue in biology, now research is all math. So you would be happy doing this kind of work. So it's just something to think about as you go forward. So when I wound up transferring, I wound up transferring as a biomedical engineering major instead of just straight electrical engineering like I had originally thought. And there I started doing like neuroscience research, and it kind of wound up being that along the way I thought, oh, I really like the theory that I'm doing, but I'm losing touch with any kind of human application. So that's what sort of made me start thinking about the MD, and it just kind of coalesced over time as I just sought out more clinical experience that, yes, this was something I wanted to keep up, and that would free me up to do more theory work during my PhD. So, and then I kind of ended up here.
Um, could y'all talk a little more about, I don't know, finding your first research experience, what you did during that first research experience, and yeah, I think that's the end of the question.
Yeah, sure. So my first research experience, I kind of mentioned, I was really fortunate that my community college partnered with this local research institute. And essentially you had to apply for the position, and they picked students to be able to have that research experience. So I was really lucky. That was kind of my first introduction to research. I was originally just a pre-med student, and all pre-meds kind of are told you need to do some research if you're going to apply to medical school. So for me, I didn't look at it as much as, oh, I really am interested in research. For me, it was more of like, oh, I need to do this. But I worked at an aging research institute where we essentially studied genetic deletions that result in either an increase in lifespan or a decrease in lifespan. Using yeast as our and C. elegans as our model. And it was just really cool. I think the field of aging is so interesting because it has such, even for somebody that's like a novel or, novel scientist, it's so easy to understand the implications of the research. And I think, having that translational aspect early on, I think probably was important for me to kind of consider research as a career. So that was my first research experience. My second experience was at UC Davis, where I completed my bachelor's degree. And I studied microtubule and microtubule-associated proteins and kind of how they regulate cellular transport or trafficking within the cell. And specifically how these, maybe think of them kind of as like road sign type proteins that kind of say turn left here, go straight here, here's the exit, for this street, kind of how these additional proteins are regulating that transport. And it was a lot of, really intense biochemical work. And I ended up doing it the summer after I graduated as well. And ended up resulting in a publication, which was really cool to be a part of, a publication process and all of that. And then, I loved all of the research so much, it made me question whether or not I really wanted to pursue an MD PhD versus just a PhD. So I ended up doing some clinical work as a medical scribe during my gap years. But yeah, that's kind of my research background and history right now. I study DNA damage and repair at the Cancer Center here at the U of A.
So for me, my first research experience, I think, was my senior year in university. So I had some like health issues and a brain injury, and was like, there's no way I'm going to do very well in a lab like when I'm dealing with all this stuff. So I kind of delayed starting doing research until my senior year, and it was actually really not a bad thing. So I worked in a lab that studied extremophile viruses. So I'm really interested in neuroscience, but I also really love viruses and molecular biology. And my university didn't have a neuroscience department, so we all kind of scrapped together our own curriculum and like had a neuroscience club and kind of like built our own kind of major out of it. So the very first lab I joined was like very cool biology lab where we actually went and did like field work. So we would go and actually scoop viruses out of hot springs and like acidic goo and like really cool like mountain environments. And we went camping together, and then our car broke down, so we camped longer. And like it was really fun. So even though I guess I would say I had like a later research experience, it was still like super fulfilling and definitely worth doing. And then after that, I think it took about a year for me to get a lab job that was like a legit like salary job with like health benefits, which was really cool because I never had that before. And then I studied nephrology and hypertension and used, like human cells and mice. So very different from like extremophile archaea that you find only one place in the world. But it was really cool to kind of go at it with such a broad range of experiences, like working with archaea and cells and mice. Was really an interesting. It had a lot of interesting like interview potential. Like when I was interviewing for med schools, people just asking like, "What is an archaea?" and like getting to geek out about them was very fun. So I know that like a lot of people stress getting early experience, but it's not totally the end of the world if you don't. So don't worry about it. And then now I study pharmacology, specifically chaperone protein inhibitors and Alzheimer's disease. So I'm doing a bunch of really cool pilot experiments right now. Yep, that's me.
I would echo that. You don't really need to stress if you haven't started research. I did zero research during my community college years, just because nobody really did it around there. I did do like, engineering projects, but those are not the same at all. And then my first research job was actually a work study job in art history. So not also completely unrelated to science. And there are very few MD PhD programs that would ever let you do that as a PhD, although not impossible. And then sometime around the end of my first semester after transferring, there was a research fair where there were some PIs who were looking for people interested in their projects. And there was a cool project in neuroimaging and psychiatry that I was like, oh, I have the programming background. I could totally do that. And it just kind of went from there. I stuck with that for the rest of my time in undergrad, and then actually joined a related lab for my full-time research afterwards.
How do you all go about navigating completing, all the requirements or like academic requirements needed to apply for med school, right? Having attended various institutions, making sure you check off those boxes that you inevitably have to.
Sorry. I would say, sorry, my cat is hanging out with us today too. I would say that, I really had a hard time, figuring out, how to be successful as an applicant applying to medical school, much less an MD PhD program. I was really fortunate that faculty at my community college really connected me with students that were a little bit ahead of me in similar processes. I had one colleague and friend that successfully applied and got into a DO program. And I had another colleague that applied to PhD programs, and they just kind of, gave me all of the advice that they had based on their own experiences. And I think it was kind of a hodgepodge of different, pieces of advice. And I just had to take what was useful and forget what wasn't. But I think it was really challenging. And to anyone out there that's considering this path, like I know it's really overwhelming and challenging. So don't get discouraged. But I really leaned on mentors and colleagues that were ahead of me in the process. And I think, since going through this process, I got so, fired up, like, why is this so hard? And why don't I understand what you need to do? And I ended up getting really heavily involved with the admissions teams at the College of Medicine, as well as the MSTP program, so that I could really help mentor other students, especially community college students, because I know it's so hard and so challenging. So.
Like I would say maybe one of the hardest parts for me was financially. So like as I moved forward, as I was like, okay, I'm gonna apply for the MD PhD program, I have to get research experience, I have to get clinical experience, I have to get this and that. It's like it started with like one more roommate, like living in the living room. We turned into a living bedroom with like a curtain, and then it turned into like two more roommates, and then like we literally like had to penny pinch everything. Like I lived on rice and beans for like way too long, and just like having like no family support, having like very low income background, and trying to like satisfy all of these requirements was really, really hard. But I think that if you know you really want it, it's going to pay off later. Like it will show like all of the penny pinching you have to do, all of the sacrifices you have to make, like when you're getting interviewed, like that will come out. Like they'll totally see that like, okay, this person is like pretty intense and serious that they want to do this, versus like someone who just like applied on a whim and didn't really think about it or something like that, or who had opportunities that they didn't really have to fight for. Like there's definitely like a difference. And I also work in admissions too, like Danielle. Like our school is really cool in that it lets students be pretty heavily involved in admissions. So like, like the difference of interviewing someone who kind of is just like curious versus someone who absolutely knows that they want to do it is like very, very obvious. And I guess in a weird way, I kind of feel lucky that I was rejected the first time I applied. So I applied like fresh out of graduating for my bachelor's, and it was kind of nice that I had some extra time to like work on publications. So like my undergrad research experiences, even though I really liked them and I had a lot of fun, like I just didn't like I didn't have any publications. Like it was a much slower pace working with extremophile viruses than like if you work with like mice or like biological, like human biology kind of translational stuff. So like the time points of like when you start an experiment, when you publish is like way different depending on the field you're in. So just being able to talk about those experiences, even though I didn't have a publication, and like just being able to like present at local research conferences and stuff, that really helped. But I guess I'm just trying to say, like, if you're stubborn enough, you can definitely get there. And like, even though it really sucks, like at some points, if we have like similar backgrounds and it sucks for you, it's not going to suck forever, and it's always going to be temporary. And eventually you'll look back and say like, how did I survive undergrad? Like sometimes I'll scroll my Google Calendar like too far, like, and I'll go to like 2015 or something, and I'll be like, oh my god, like what was I doing? How was I like going to 4 different places every day and like working 2 jobs and going to classes? And when you finally get to med school, I wouldn't say it's easier, but I would say that once you have like dedicated time and you're not like completely getting ripped apart by like balancing different jobs and all these things, it's a lot easier to study when you're like stable. And like one thing I like about the MD PhD program is that tuition is not something to worry about. Finances are not something that you have to worry about nearly as much. So yeah, just be stubborn, stay stubborn.
I like that be stubborn approach to things. Um, uh, in terms of like fulfilling the requirements for me, I was very lucky in that when I transferred, we had an insanely strong pre-med, pre-professional advising committee. So really when I was sure that I was going to be like looking at this path, I sat down with them and they kind of like helped me map out like what my remaining courses were. I would echo that. I kind of wish I had thought about taking organic chemistry before transferring, because it was much harder doing it with someone who does research in organic chemistry than with someone who enjoys teaching, which I would say was the case at my community college. Like they were much more focused on teaching than the abstract concepts. So you can think about that a little bit, but at the end of the day, really, as long as like you hit the check boxes in some way, shape, or form, you know, you'll have a decent shot. I think a lot of committees approach this more holistically now too, where your background in research and your motivation are important. Like, not to downplay grades, but you know, once you're above a threshold, then that's all that they're there for.
There's a question here about transferring to a four-year institution. Like, what considerations went into that? You know, whether it's a big research school, a private institution, like what were you looking at? And what were your considerations when making that decision to transfer?
Yeah, so I transferred from Santa Rosa Junior College to UC Davis. And out of high school, I always wanted to go to UC Davis. I kind of knew that's where I wanted to go. I didn't know, you know, after graduating high school, I didn't know that people, first of all, that they studied for the SAT or that they applied to more than one college. You know, I thought, oh, I just want to go here. That's where I want to go. I'm going to apply there. Well, I applied to UC Davis and I didn't get in. And so I ended up attending community college especially because they had a transfer admission guarantee with UC Davis, as well as a few other UC schools, which meant that all of the credits were transferable. And as long as you got the minimum GPA, you were guaranteed acceptance as a transfer student, that's really was a huge reason why I selected UC Davis. I did see, your question about, you know, maybe picking an institution that's more focused on research versus private schools. I know there are some private schools that partner with local institutions. So I would be shocked to find that the private school had zero access to research or research opportunities. And I would say maybe that's one consideration, but I think that there are a lot of other maybe more important considerations like your happiness, you know, how long it's going to take you to graduate, the cost of your education going there, you know, the fit for you and what you want to major in. And, you know, like there's so many other things that I think if you want to find a research opportunity, there are so many ways to do so outside of just researching with that single institution. So I wouldn't make that decision maybe solely based on that information. Personally.
I would just echo that statement. Really, this is such a long path that, you know, doing what makes you happy is what's paramount. And if you want to do this, you know, MD PhD thing, you'll find ways to do that that don't conflict with, you know, what you really also want to be doing along the way.
Yeah, also, like, if you go to like maybe like a school that's very strict and you're burnt out from the second you graduate, I think that that's like really hard because a lot of people say like med school is a marathon, not a sprint, but like the MD PhD program is like you're backpacking for like months in the middle of nowhere. Like it's like you really have to be like self-sustaining. You have to find what brings you joy, and you have to make sure that it doesn't like eat away at you, because there are some, you know, like little pockets of lab cultures that are just awful. Like you will get yelled at, you will get demeaned, like, and then there's others that are just perfect and they're fine and they're everyone's friends and they go out for lunch. And like I've experienced like both of those. And it really makes a difference. So honestly, I would just try to figure out which school, specifically the department, like the degree that you're interested in getting, like which one is more supportive, because that's going to matter way more than like if you had a cooler research project or something. Like I feel like doing research when you're miserable is not as productive as you might think it would be. Like it definitely holds you back. even if you do a lot of cool research. If it's just eating away at you, it's just not worth it.
How do you all feel that starting off at a community college has informed your perspective either as a student or moving forward as a physician scientist or as a physician in general?
I think that starting at community college taught me that like academia doesn't have to be terrible. So like my foundation is like I was a work study library technician for like ever, like the whole time I was in community college, and then worked in the community college library for I think 9 years total, like after I graduated, and just like having a sense of community and like stable like faculty that are always there to bounce ideas off of. Like I'm still in touch with a lot of people from my community college, and we're always like cheering each other on. A lot of my classmates are teachers now, or they're also PhD students, and it's very cool. But like I think if I had started at university, I probably would have dropped out, to be honest, because I had like no support going in and wasn't sure what to expect. And I think the community college kind of helped build these like supportive pillars for my career in a way. Or like if something goes really wrong, like I have people that I can call on, versus if I started at university and I'm in a class of like 200 people off the bat, like I don't think that I would like maybe made as close of connections to those professors. And also like it's kind of instilled like this like desire to give back. So I really want to help community colleges have more research opportunities, more pre-med like tracks, and more pre-med like opportunities overall. So that's something I really want to do in my career later. So yeah, I probably wouldn't be in this program if I didn't start at community college, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Britt said. I think for me, I think community college really like was a time for me to like grow so much as a person. I also felt really fortunate that I ended up not getting into Davis initially and staying home and going to community college in my hometown. It meant that I got to spend more time with a sick family member of mine, which just was so like, I really believe that things are just meant to be sometimes, even if you're taking a different path or a different track. And so I really feel like it was just exactly where I was meant to be. And then, community college was, for me, it was a lot harder than, I transferred to UC Davis, which is a pretty good school. But community college was challenging. And I think that it really gave me a strong foundation in science and a real like genuine interest and passion for research and for really understanding what's going on and breaking it down. And I think that was instrumental into pushing me towards a career in research and as a physician. So I feel really lucky and fortunate that I attended community college. I think it was fantastic for me.
I would echo that. I think that the folks who I met at community college were way more interesting in some ways. I think a lot of it just had to do with more lived experience. And also a lot of them were a lot more motivated as to why they were there, and not just, oh, I'm going to college because that's the next thing to do. They had like a very strong reason of why they were there. And so I think that that was formative in helping shape and like how I approached like what I wanted to do next. And so, yeah, I would agree that I think community college was a great first choice.
Maybe a little bit of a pivot, but what are y'all's clinical interests, or how do you feel that intersects with the research work you might do moving forward or are currently doing?
So my current research, I study DNA damage and repair pathways. And specifically, I study a very small polymerase, DNA polymerase beta, which is part of the base excision repair pathway. It repairs up to 50,000 base lesions per cell per day. That is a massive repair capacity. And essentially, I study different variants of this particular protein that exists within humans. And I'm working to understand whether or not these variants might predispose these individuals to cancer development. So my focus, my PhD will be in cancer biology. And I hope to at least go into internal medicine and probably hematology oncology fellowship following medical graduation. So that's probably where I will end up, but I have kind of dabbled in the thought of radiation oncology, perhaps, or, I think for me, I think especially being a community college student and having, a really strong sense of community, also being first generation and just, I don't know, really caring about like helping people and providing equity, within the field of medicine. I think I have a strong pull towards also just doing maybe like internal medicine and being like, more of a generalized practitioner that can help more wide scale. So I think that's a pull I feel within me. But yeah, we'll have to see where I end up.
Kind of similar here. So I've always been interested in neuroscience and neurology, but sometimes like I feel a pull towards family medicine. I feel a pull towards internal medicine and just like being able to provide care for people in rural environments. And I kind of have an open mind though. Like I love pathology, like as a culture. Like every pathologist you'll ever meet is the most wholesome person in the entire world. Like they will like make you hot chocolate. They'll like give you cookies. Like they're just really nice in general. And I think that pathology, like in terms of culture, is like very nice. And also like you could be a neuropathologist. There aren't that many in the US, and it's like a very very needed specialty, especially like with our studies into CTE and like football and traumatic brain injuries and things like that. I do feel a pull towards pathology, but I think that like maybe like my dream would be like being a nocturnal neurologist, because like I have a sleep disorder and I have like a bunch of neurological disorders, and I'm like, oh, that'd be kind of cool, like because it always sucks to have to go to the doctor like 7 or 8 in the morning for neurology patients because like they can't sleep sometimes and like it's just awful. But like what if I practice at like midnight? That would be perfect for everybody because I'm like more nocturnal. So I think about that a lot. So probably neurology, maybe family med, I don't know.
Yeah, continuing with the I don't know train. I don't really know. Part of the issue, so my research is in neuro and it's all very computational modeling in neuro. So it can pivot into a lot of different things. And thankfully, a lot of it is based on data that other people collect, which makes it easier from a clinical perspective to like integrate, like you can take data from collaborators and help that see how that interacts with your patients in different ways. So most likely something brain related. I've always leaned more neuro, maybe neurosurge, if I really want another 7 years afterwards. But I don't know about psychiatry yet. And the reason I don't know is because there's a very strong selection bias in how our psychiatry department was created for very well-adjusted people. So I always get along with the psychiatrists. My experience here sounds like with your experience with the pathologists, that they're all like super nice people. Like I can have a great conversation with them about anything. So I don't know if I actually like psychiatry or I just like all the psychiatrists that I work with here. And that's something that I think I have to wait till clinicals to find out.
We're moving closer to the end of this event. So I'm encouraging folks to put any other questions they have. But in the meantime, what do you think has been your favorite thing or most surprising thing about your training so far?
I would say for me, I think it's been really cool and exciting to, have basically maybe for people that don't know how the MD PhD program is structured, I call it like a PhD sandwich. So you do the first 2 years of med school, then you do the PhD, and then you finish the last 2 years of med school. So I'm kind of like mid sandwich. I've already finished the first 2 years of medical school, which are all like clinical courses and whatnot. And I'm in my PhD I've completed all my PhD courses, but I think when I was in my PhD doing these courses, I think it was so cool to be in a classroom of people that had a completely different perspective than me. Their perspective was very research focused. A lot of them were PhD or master's students, and they kind of saw problems from a different perspective compared to maybe where I saw problems, which is like very clinical, clinically focused. And I think having that kind of epiphany of like, oh, it's really cool to kind of think about problems differently and be able to collaborate with people in a different way. I think that's been really cool so far.
I'm honestly still thinking, because like there's a lot of like good surprises and a lot of bad surprises. Like, so being a disabled person in med school and then trying to get accommodations for STEP was like a nightmare, and it's the same for like the MCAT. Like it's very difficult to get accommodations. So like that was like a bad surprise, but the good surprise part of it is like you aren't alone. So like disabled medical students do exist. There's a lot of people who are managing chronic illnesses and also trying to study like a bajillion hours a day, and like it's definitely doable. And I feel like there isn't enough visibility because there's still a lot of stigma. But one thing that I'm like really excited about is like the increasing visibility and the increasing awareness like in medical schools of just like not being terrible and ableist all the time. There's still like technical standards and things that say like, oh, if you can't hear or think a certain way, like you can't be a doctor, and that's like almost in every medical school's handbook for technical standards, which doesn't make any sense because there's plenty of people who have become deaf or lost their sight or whatever, like after they're done with their training and after they're done with residency, and their physician's just fine. So I feel like there's like a weird filter process, but I think that I'm like starting to notice like the tears in that filter. Like I'm starting to notice like more of us are getting in and more of us are getting louder. So it's like really exciting. Although it's like kind of one of those things where it's like, it's also kind of a bad thing that it is that way, but it's like good that it's changing. So that's one thing.
I think overall the thing that I'm most excited about has been, I feel really lucky that I enjoy most of the time what I get to do. There's always some things that you're not going to enjoy along the way, but taking this path, I would say a lot of the time I'm very happy with the work that I get to do. Like it's challenging. It's something that I'm interested in. I get to learn new things. So I think it's been a great time that I get to pursue things that keep me very engaged along the way.
Great. Looks like the panelists for the next session are coming on. So I want to take a moment and really thank Britt, Danielle, and Anthony for their time today, for sharing their experiences starting off at community college and how that has turned into where they are now. I put a link in the chat for y'all to give us feedback and ideas of things you'd like to see APSA work with. And I will hand it off to the folks who run the interactive sessions to prep for the next event. I hope some of you guys stick around for that too. All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Just let me know. All righty. So welcome to another one of APSA's interactive sessions of the 2021 through 2022 academic year. We are pleased to host tonight's session with physician scientists titled A Day in the Life of a Physician Scientist. I'd now like to have our wonderful panelists go around and introduce themselves. Let's start off with Dr. Evan Noak.
Hey, how's it going, guys? I'm Evan Nock. I'm at Weill Cornell Medicine, assistant professor of neurology and neuro-oncology. So I split my time seeing brain tumor patients with neurological problems. And in the lab, I work on addressing tumor metabolism through dietary and targeted therapies.
Yeah, Dr. Na is an assistant professor with the Department of Neurology within the Division of Neuro-Oncology at Weill Cornell Medical College. And next we have Dr. Freddie Escorcia. Dr. Escorcia is an investigator and an Alaska clinical research scholar within the Molecular Imaging and Radiation Oncology at NCIS, or NCI Center for Cancer Research. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I think you kind of already did. Yeah, so sorry. So one of the things that we focus on in the lab is building targeted agents for imaging and therapy of human cancers. And I'm a radiation oncologist, which means I treat patients who have cancer in the clinic. Thank you.
Sweet. And lastly, we have Dr. Elizabeth Felton. Dr. Felton is an assistant professor of neurology and biomedical engineering at the University of Wisconsin Medical School and Public Health.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Felton, and I specialize in epilepsy and have interest in the ketogenic diet for the treatment of epilepsy and do clinical research around that. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And thank you guys so much for taking the time out to be here with us. We are so grateful that you really took the time out to come virtually to meet or to our meeting to provide your wisdom and pearls to folks thinking about what's due during their gap years. My name is Sophie, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I am a second-year undergraduate student at Xavier University of Louisiana, and in the chat box helping us moderate, we have Monica, who is our first-year MSTP student at the University of Miami, and our volunteer live tweeting the event will be Fatima, who is a recent graduate from Penn State University. And for those who are going to step away or miss a piece of it, as a reminder, we will have it recorded. And as the moderator, I will remind you to please submit your questions to the Q&A box. We have already received those submissions during the registration process, and we have a team of co-moderators behind the scenes collecting questions live. You can submit the questions in the chat box. Okay, I think that's all the announcements we have. Thank you guys so much again for being here, and I'm going to go ahead and start off with our first question. All right, so why did you decide to become a physician scientist, and what did that journey look like for you? You guys can choose who goes first.
All right, well, I can start with that. So I was at NYU for my undergraduate degree, and it was during my junior year that I was doing research in a laboratory after having done prior summers of research that a postdoc in the lab said to me, hey, in addition to applying for medical school, which I had planned to apply for, I should think about double degree programs. And as is probably happening to many of you, although some of you are on this call, so hopefully you're aware of these, I didn't know that there were such things as MD PhD programs. And so I said, what's that? And they described it was a double degree program. And when I looked into them more in detail, I thought they sounded very appealing because I really liked the marriage of medical training. I shadowed in clinics along with the research that I was doing. So I chose to apply to MD PhD programs, and then went down to Philadelphia to Temple. And while I was there, I really enjoyed going back and forth with the clinic and with the research that I was doing. And not to take too long, but fast forwarding into residency, I was in a research track, and I really got to see what it was like to actually be in a clinic for half a day a week or a day a week, and then go back to the lab. And being able to refresh yourself with both of those domains, I think, is very helpful. So you can get frustrated in the lab with experiments that don't work, and then you go talk to patients, and the personal encounter, I think, is very energizing to me. But sometimes you have bad days in clinic where, unfortunately, in my world, you're telling people they have brain tumors, or even worse, that their brain tumors come back, and then you kind of get refreshed with talking about experiments in lab, which hopefully will go well. And the questions from lab ultimately come from the clinic. And that's the questions that I try to answer. And so having both of those in my life allows me, I think, to be successful in both domains, because I understand some of the basic mechanisms of patients' diseases that I treat. And then I can also try to address those issues in lab.
Sweet. Thank you so much for that answer. Dr. Felton, would you like to go?
Sure. So my journey to becoming a physician scientist was a little bit indirect. So I was not the person who, knew I wanted to be a doctor since I was a child or anything like that. I did my undergraduate in chemical engineering at Northwestern. And at the time I was more interested in research, although my specialization within chemical engineering was biomedical, and like all the research that I did was sort of biomedical related. And so after undergrad, I worked for a couple of years, and during that time, I volunteered in a hospital, and this was just because I wanted to do that. It wasn't that I was like building up a resume for medical school or anything like that. And I really enjoyed that. And then I did go back to do initially a master's degree. And it was actually not until that point that I even heard about the MD PhD program. It was just something that either had been off my radar or hadn't been, exposed to before. And the research that I was working on was with a physician. And so I was like working with the physician in clinic and doing, the research that I was doing at that time. And it really just all came together. And I decided to apply for MD PhD programs. And so I did, and ended up staying at the University of Wisconsin for that. And I did my PhD in biomedical engineering. And then went on to do a neurology residency and epilepsy fellowship. And I did some research during my residency and fellowship, and then now I'm on faculty at the University of Wisconsin, like I was saying earlier, kind of doing clinical research. And so the research that I did for my PhD is different than what I'm doing now, but that's okay. The PhD is really a time to get those fundamental research skills nailed down, and then you're kind of open to what you are doing in the future. And for me, being a physician scientist has been awesome because it's just, Dr. Nook was saying, like you see a problem in the clinic and you have the tools to be able to investigate that further in the lab. You can't, it's not just like, oh, okay, like interesting observation or something like that. And so that's been really satisfying for me.
Thank you for your answer. And Dr. Scorsha?
I guess I'm up, right? So I was kind of lucky. I discovered this path relatively early. I attended one of these panels where they had PhD students and MD PhD students and MD students. And I was like, wait, what is going on? This combination degree deal. And I found this at a point in undergrad when I was a sophomore, where I was really liking the science. I was like, cool, I'm set. Like, I want to go to med school, I want to help people. I like the science, I'm good. But then I was like, well, what about this like research side? I'm liking the science a lot. We always have to check that box as pre-meds. And as little by little, I started liking it more. And then, the fact that I didn't have to choose was appealing. So like defer that choice down the line, and then, see where it leads me. Because at that point, I really couldn't choose. As in my MD PhD program, Evan and I went to the same program. I ended up focusing on cancer, so that was of interest. And when I was done with the PhD, I had a great time, great mentor, great experience. I was kind of done. I was like, I could take it or leave it. I would do it again in a heartbeat, but I could take it or leave it. And then I was as a third year med student, it was the first rotation on clinical rotation. Within a couple of weeks, I'm like asking questions to the residents. I'm like, hey, so like, how does this work? Like, why are we doing this? Et cetera, et cetera. And then everyone's looking at me as if I'm like a crazy person. They're like, what's going on? Who is this weirdo? And I was like, oh, like I'm built differently here. Like I want to know the answers to these questions. Like, why are we doing this? Rather than like, no, this is what we do. Sometimes there's a role for that, but the why sort of brought me back into the research side. So then as a resident, I pursued additional research and still do it now.
Thank you guys so much for your answers. That definitely is very enlightening for me, especially. So what does a day-to-day look like, and how much time do you spend with your patients versus in the lab? And if you want, we can go in the same order that we went in last time.
Okay, great. So right now I spend about 75% of my time doing research, and the other 25% is split doing everything else. And the everything else, as you get older, becomes more things. So it was initially half a day a week of clinic, which if you become a clinical clinician investigator is usually a full day. So half day kind of spills over often with notes and administrative aspects. And then I also work with residents. So I oversee a resident clinic a month. And then I consult on the wards with neuro-oncology cases and also general neurology cases. And then from the educational perspective, there was an opportunity at Weill Cornell to take over the leadership of the preclinical neuroscience, neurology, and psychiatry curriculum, which is, as you may know, if you're in this part of the training right now, is about in our case about 8 weeks of neurology and psychiatry, and I lead the neurology aspect of that. So I organize the curriculum, I lecture, I organize the small groups, we work on quizzes, and then we take student feedback, and that's a course in the fall. So I do a variety of different things in that 25% of the time, but I think it allows me to pursue different interests and expertise that I have in my current field.
So my breakdown currently is about 50% clinical and 50% everything else. And so the clinical is broken up into a few different things. So one would be clinic, where I see patients with epilepsy, and part of that is the ketogenic diet clinic that I run. And that's, kind of part of the research program as well. I also have a women's epilepsy clinic where I see women with epilepsy during pregnancy. I also do inpatient weeks during the year where I am attending for the epilepsy monitoring unit and reading EEGs. And I also do intraoperative monitoring, which is when patients are having certain types of brain and spine surgeries. I monitor their electrophysiologic signals to hopefully make sure they don't wake up with a deficit. So that's kind of the clinical component. And then I mentioned I do some clinical research. I also am associate director for our medical scientist training program here, as well as diversity officer for the Department of Neurology. So that's kind of, and then lots of meetings, and I do a little bit of teaching here and there. I don't teach a course, but giving lectures and things like that occasionally.
So you saw here, I'm solo parenting. My wife's traveling for work, so trying to juggle all the things, right? So what is a day? Each day is different, as you can imagine. I think it sort of depends on whether you're doing a research day versus a clinical day. A clinical days, I'm at the National Institutes of Health in the National Cancer Institute. So it's a very select group of patients that comes our way. Everybody has to be in a clinical trial. So you don't often end up seeing patients that are earlier in their disease course. So as a consequence, there's not that big a patient component to what I'm doing. But on a given day, I'll have patients scheduled, I'll see them, I'll talk to them about their cancer, I'll talk to them about the role of radiation for their cancer. Radiation is an important treatment, one of the main treatments for cancers, and more than 50% of patients that get diagnosed with cancer will eventually see us. So it's either curative or it can be palliative, meaning that we help them if there's some symptoms as a consequence of their cancer. So help with pain, for example. We used to have a residency program. We don't anymore. So I used to work with residents, but we do have some trainees that kind of circle through, either medical students or post-baccalaureate fellows that are, looking to get some exposure prior to applying to med school and things like that. And then it's just dealing with consults. So we're typically outpatient. So there's inpatient and outpatient medicine. There's some of the patients that are in the hospital, they may want us to evaluate them for radiation emergently because they're having some symptoms now. Some other patients will be outpatient, so we'll schedule them in a couple of weeks, just make sure that there's nothing that needs to be addressed today. And that's usually, let's say, the clinical side. On the lab side, a bunch of meetings with collaborators or my team, and trying to map out, troubleshoot experiments, what are the next steps. So a lot of teaching and learning from that. And it's every day is different. It's kind of fun, actually. It kind of keeps you on your toes. And honestly, even every meeting can be different from a completely different collaborator. So I'll be talking about one particular project where it's like all chemistry all the time, and I'm like, whoa. The next meeting is entirely clinical trial based. We're trying to figure out how to improve patient recruitment. The next one is I'm talking to some undergrads that are interested in going to medical school. Right, so it's all over the place, and it keeps me interested,
That is amazing how all of you guys are able to balance all of this, and especially these two different careers. It's amazing. But along those lines,
we don't always succeed, for the record.
I could just imagine that there'd be some sort of struggle, but you found the way. But yeah, along those lines, how do you guys handle the work life and the or work and home life balance? And do you think that it's very challenging, or was it a huge adjustment at all?
Should we go in reverse order now or keep going in the same order?
Sure, we can do reverse this time.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So how do we do it? I think it's one of these things where you have to choose which one you're going to be not as good at, right? You won't be able to succeed at all the things all at once. So, early on when for us, for example, as faculty, right? When you're launching your research program, you have to invest a lot of time on that side. So you may not be as good, at least also speak for myself, maybe the rest of the panelists are much better than I am on this. So I ended up kind of holding off on building my clinical program until my lab was up and running. So right now we're at a point where the momentum's kind of going. I don't need to be there every day, for example, to make sure things are going okay. I have enough senior people that can sort of do the day-to-day troubleshooting. So now I'm trying to build our referral base for patients, so I can see more patients that have the particular illnesses that I'm interested in treating, and then helping enroll in clinical trials, right? So early on I was not as good a clinician. Now I'm getting a little bit better at clinician. Maybe I'm becoming a worse scientist all around the day. I may be a worse or a better dad and husband. So it sort of cycles. I think you can't be 100% for all the things, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think like the terminology around this has kind of changed over the years. It used to be called like work-life balance. Now it's like work-life integration. And I saw there was also a question in the chat related to this about, how I've balanced being a physician scientist and a mom. So I think that there's never a perfect balance and that it changes from day to day. So maybe and weekend to weekend. So maybe one weekend I'm going to be, attending all my kids' sports and music activities. And the next weekend I'm going to do some work. And it kind of goes back and forth. Or maybe I'm going to bring my work to the sports activity, kind of, watch and work at the same time. Or like today, there's a snow day here in Wisconsin. And so my kids were home from school. And so I worked from home. And so, no, I was not in front of my computer the whole day, nor was I playing with them the whole day, and so it's kind of like a little bit of back and forth. And I think that, there's just has never been kind of a perfect balance for me. I had my first child, my last year of residency, and my second child, my last year of fellowship. And I started my faculty position with my youngest one was 6 weeks old. And so, it's been, my whole first year on faculty is a little bit of a blur, to be honest with you. But, it's just about managing and doing the best you can and, balancing priorities from day to day, and it shifts, and also having to be flexible, so I kind of knew that there probably weren't going to have school today, but sometimes unexpected things come up with the kids. They're sick or something like that. And I have a very supportive partner as well, who's able to help with the childcare responsibilities. But, I think it's just been over the years, just, kind of a give and take, working on that integration and, realizing that it's never going to be perfect and doing the best that I can in that day.
Yeah, I think that balancing personal life and career is difficult, right? If anyone says these things, they're just lying to you. So don't believe that. I think you have to go into it with certain goals about how you're going to balance the two. When I started residency, the first day of internship, they gave us kind of a piece of paper and we had to write goals down for our year. And my goal was in New York City to like enjoy one thing that was New York City related once a week. So if it was like going to a restaurant, going to a show, walking through Central Park, just something that got me out of the hospital that I could enjoy. And so I think setting something concrete is important because then you can stick to those goals, something that's actually like achievable, and that doesn't make you go crazy trying to balance those things. I also think that having a personal life is very important to keep you grounded. Obviously, that's one way to protect against burnout, which is all over literature these days for many career paths, including ours. And so, seeing friends or having a partner, having children, as difficult as it is, I think brings you a lot of joy, just the same way like a good experiment or a good patient outcome brings you joy. Because when those things don't go well, then at least something in your personal life hopefully can go well. So the way that you can actually achieve that and manage that, I think, just like Elizabeth said, depends on your support system. So build that support system early. Use your family, use your friends to keep you grounded and make sure that they're there when you don't have great days, because there's going to be those bad days. And also when you progress to different stages, so meeting a partner, having children, you have people there to help you when, for example, there's a snow day in Wisconsin and you can't be in lab or can't be in clinic because you need to have childcare, or Freddie's partner is not in town. And those things happen. And so you have to plan for those eventualities because, even if you have patients calling, in a lot of cases, your family is more important. So you need to have backup plans.
Thank you so much for your answers. And that was such a great point you guys really try to find the optimism in all of this, which is definitely something I feel like a lot of physicians that I've talked to seem to struggle with at times. But like you said, having a great family and a support system sounds like it'll bring you through it. But do you guys think, or do you guys ever feel behind your peers that only went to medical school? And do you feel as if you're more financially burdened because of it? Or do you feel as though your family plans were put on hold or hindered by the few extra years between that?
Are we going? Am I up? I guess. All right. So there are a couple embedded questions here. What was the first one again? Sorry. Do I feel behind the MDs?
Right. Do you feel behind the people
Yeah.
that went straight there?
So, I mean, I think we all sort of encounter residency a little bit differently. Sort of depends. So where I trained, it was very, very heavy clinical, but they also had research, right? So they try to balance it too. But when you're clinical, you're all clinical, and you're there with the folks that are MD, and they want to go to private practice, and this is what they're doing. They're going to be seeing patients, so they want to be as good at that as possible. So one of the things that allows you to sort of maintain that confidence on the clinical side is making sure that you get the appropriate clinical training, so then you don't feel like you're behind, right? What ends up happening later is that you specialize, right? So then you're not having to be up to date with all of the things, but rather a subset of a subset of a thing. And that allows you to be an expert in the thing, even though you don't do it every single day, right? And it allows you to sort of keep up. The other thing was debt, I think you were saying, or money, financial things, and then family things, right? On the money side, I mean, MD PhD programs are generally speaking covered stipend, right? So your med school tuition is covered, and your grad school tuition is covered, and you have a stipend, so you do come out debt free. I joke that we pay with our youth, so there is a cost, right? And everything is deferred, right? For the reality is, like, biologically for me wasn't as big a consideration, but I know some of my female colleagues have to take this into account, right? Because, like, do you want to start a family during training? Because maybe there's a little bit more flexibility on the PhD side, for example, and you have to take into account age, right? Unfortunately, that's something that you have to think about. That I didn't, right? It became an issue with my partner because she's a couple of years older than I am, right? So then we're like, oh, well, we got to have some kids now in residency, and there's never an easy time to have kids, okay? Right? So you just gotta do it, and you roll with it just like other things, and you try to make the best of it. And like Evan was saying, you sort of lean on the fam and friends.
I'll just expand on a couple of those things. So first, on the financial, like was stated, the MSTP, if you go into a medical scientist training program, usually it's covered fully, all expenses paid, and you have a stipend to live on. your medical school colleagues typically are, having to take out loans. But then of course they finish sooner, right? So they have their first, sort of post residency and or fellowship position sooner, maybe 4 years sooner or some number of years sooner. And so that means they have those years of earning potential that, are sort of ahead of you. However, when you have finished it, meaning if you do an MSTP program, you're not in debt. And so, I don't know exactly how the math works out, but I feel like for me, psychologically, it was very nice to not be in debt at the end of that program, at the, sort of when I was done. Even though people that I went to medical school who were in my medical school class, were sort of, making the big bucks, 4 or so years before I was. And so I felt very comfortable with that situation. The other thing I wanted to say about, possibly, the concept of, having to delay, having a family, I would say there is no good time. And so you just have to do it when it's right for you. And I had gone to a talk, I think when I was in grad school, where there was a woman speaker who said that she had waited too long. She was like, oh, I'll wait till after med school, after grad school, after residency, after faculty, after I get tenure. And then finally, when she was at that point, then she wasn't able to conceive. And so her advice to, us being, was at that time, the younger generation, the audience, was not to wait, that there's no good time, and that, things, you'll have your child and then you'll be able to carry on with your career. And so just that always really stuck with me. And so that's why I had one child during residency and one during fellowship, and started my faculty position with a 6-week-old, and it all worked out.
All right, great. I was just typing some answers. Very good. I will say, well, first, I don't love the wording of like only one thing or only another. So I think when you say only MD or only PhD, that wording diminishes the sort of the excellence of either of those degrees. And it's true that most physician scientists in this country are quote unquote MD only, right? So most people doing basic translational research do not have a PhD who are MDs, right? So MD PhD is still an endangered species, is very rare, and that's a lot of what we work on at APSA. So financially, it's very clear that that MDs fare better financially in the long run, right? So doing an MD, having however much debt you have, 200, 300, whatever it is, financially works out in your favor for the long run, especially if you work at an institution that's nonprofit and you are subject to the public service loan forgiveness program, which would forgive your loans after 120 payments or 10 years. So if you're in it for the money, MD PhD is not the way to go. And I tell everyone that. So this quote unquote free education is not worth it if the free part is the part for why you're applying to it. So you should really take that out of your consideration when you're applying to MD PhD, because I think that is by far like the minority reason to go into a dual training program, like by far. So take that out of your mind. The reason to go into a dual degree training program is because you're really curious about translational research. You want to be a strong basic scientist, and you want that training for not only your future medical career, because that informs how you think about patients, but also because you're interested in doing some kind of research later on and you want formal training. Doing an MD and then doing a residency and possibly a postdoc, which is a very common route in research, will certainly allow you to get involved in research, but you sort of skipped a lot of steps. And the steps are, proposing a thesis, getting your hands dirty in a lab at a young age, going to meetings, et cetera, and that formal training is often short-tracked later on. And so you can certainly do it. Many people do successfully, but I think you don't quite have the same strong research background in that case. I think regarding the personal life planning, again, never a great time to plan those things. And I think you have to try to progress in your personal life as best you can in this at a normal pace. And I wouldn't make any plans necessarily based on your stage and training program One of my co-residents had 2 children during residency, and that's a big sacrifice on both sides, right? The sacrifice to your neurology training potentially, and the sacrifice for your family life. But she felt that was a great decision, and it worked out wonderfully. She had tremendous support, and she now has 3 children, the third she had during fellowship. So there's many examples of people successfully having families at many stages of training, and you have to sort of find how it might fit in during this long stretch.
Gotcha. Thank you for those answers. And relating to that, we've received this question a lot actually. But what makes a physician scientist with an MD, PhD different than a research scientist with just a PhD, or a medical doctor who just does research, or not just, but does research? And if you want, we can start with Dr. Felton this time.
Sure. So if I understood the question, it was what does MD, PhD, how is that different than having an MD and doing research, or a PhD having maybe doing some clinical research? I guess for me, I know there are many MDs in my department who are doing very high quality research and have their own lab and have NIH grants. And so you can do research going the MD pathway. And there are many medical schools that offer opportunities for research during medical school. Here at University of Wisconsin, we have a summer program that many of the students participate in, and you can even graduate with like a special distinction in research. So there are opportunities for very motivated people who want to do medical school and, without the PhD, but still do research. For me, having the training in both allowed me for the PhD part to get really fundamental, years of training in how to do research, how does a lab run, how to write a grant, how to write a paper, and having dedicated, years of time to really learn and understand that. And then also doing medical school allowed me to really understand medicine very well, so that then I can kind of ask those, integrated questions and be able to have the toolbox to take questions from the clinic to the lab. And so there are other pathways to doing that, but I feel for me, doing the dual degree was the best way to get the most amount of training in both areas to be successful.
I'll just piggyback on that answer if that's okay. I think it's time in, right? Like, we invested the time in becoming scientists and learning sort of that craft and how to ask questions in our PhD time. And the MDs that are able to successfully navigate research down the line and run their own labs and or clinical research, et cetera, they spend time learning it. So either you learn it as a PhD student or you learn it later as a postdoctoral fellow during fellowship research time. But you need that time in for you to be able to develop as a scientist. There's no shortcuts to it, unfortunately. One sort of potential disadvantage that people sort of will comment on the MD PhD program is that's fragmented. So you'll do MD and then your research, and you go back to the clinicals generally, and then you're doing residency, and then you try to go back to research after many years of a hiatus. So that is true. It's fragmented to some extent. So then maybe doing it at the other end of it, where you're doing a fellowship, everything's sort of more contiguous. So that's one potential benefit to it. I don't know if there's a right way. So it depends on what you're feeling at the time, right?
I don't have too much to add over what Freddie and Elizabeth already stated.
Thank you for your answers. And I believe we have an announcement right now. Let's see, it might take a little second. So sorry about that. Alrighty. So let me make a quick announcement before we continue. But as a reminder, this session will be recorded and a team of co-moderators are gathering submission questions, which is where I'm actually pulling these questions from. And these come from the registration link and in real time, the chat box, Twitter, and the virtual content committee email. You will also continue to have access to an FAQ document produced by the ND PhD director panelists that we are posting in this chat. But alrighty. So our next question we have is, can MD PhD students choose any specialty, or is it best to go into certain specialties? Dr. Feldman, you can go first as well this time if you'd like.
Sure. Is that question about like medical specialty, I assume?
Yes.
I'll take it that way. Okay. You can choose any specialty. So the residency duration ranges from about 3 to 7 years. On the 3-year end is internal medicine, pediatrics, family medicine. On the 7-year end, neurosurgery. However, many people do a fellowship after that residency program. So for example, neurology was 4 years, and then I did a 2-year epilepsy fellowship. So it was 6 years total. And I think that I personally know MSTP graduates who have gone into the range of the specialties. Sometimes there are decisions made based on duration of the postgraduate training. So some people may not want to do a 7-year neurosurgery residency and then fellowship. They may want to do something shorter, but I think it's important to do what you love and what you're passionate about, because this is going to be part of your career. And many people choose their specialty based on their research interests as well. And so that often is a factor in it, especially if there's an interest in continuing that research and or doing clinical or translational research. It often makes sense to go into a particular area. And so I would say that many MSTP trainees, by the time it's sort of time to start applying, are very clear on what specialty they want to go into.
Yeah, okay, I can go. Yeah, I agree with Elizabeth that any specialty will work. And I think nowadays there's even more unusual specialties to go into that are classically MD, PhD associated. The most common ones, at least from APSIS perspective, that we've found are internal medicine, pediatrics, pathology, surgery, neurology. Yeah, and rad onc are kind of like the 6 most common specialties, but many other specialties that haven't traditionally had as much translational research, I think, are really finding that physician scientists can ask the important questions and can address a lot of shortcomings in terms of advancements in the field. So I think it's in everyone's best interest to think creatively, and don't think that just because you're not one of the sort of common interested people, like you don't want to do cancer research, or you don't want to do something in the brain, or that's not important. There are a lot of questions to ask in many specialties, and actually, to be honest, if you're looking at NIH funding, and Freddie knows this, it's probably a lot easier to not be in one of those specialties in terms of funding pay lines, because, for example, like the pay lines at like the National Eye Institute or even dermatological institutes are much better than NCI.
Dental.
Yeah, dental, right? So yeah, even dental. So in some ways, distinguishing yourself by being a little unusual might be very helpful to you in the long run in terms of grant funding. So keep that in mind as well.
Nothing to add.
Thank you guys. That was such a new perspective, especially about choosing which specialty to go into. So what would you guys say is the most meaningful part of your work? And Dr. No, you can start us off if you'd like.
That's a good question. I think a tie for the most meaningful aspect of my work is taking care of patients and mentoring. I think I find that to be very meaningful. I like teaching. I like instructing kind of the next generation of physicians, of educators, of scientists. And so I do that with a lot of the things that I do, both in lab and the educational curriculum. and I find a lot of enjoyment out of talking to patients. So though I enjoy the research, of course, I think it's not always fulfilling to me personally, because I get results and I have findings, but I think most of the fulfillment is actually like some of the other aspects of the science that I do.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think my answer will be pretty similar to what you just heard. So, um, you know, as I mentioned, I do ketogenic diet for adults with epilepsy, which is not very commonly offered. And there's about 15 places in the country where you can go to have that for adults. It's pretty common for children. And so many of the patients I see, this is like the first time they're hearing about it. And for the ones that it works for, it's just very fulfilling, just the feedback that I get from the patients and seeing them be able to go from being on disability due to their seizures to being able to work and drive and just be much happier. So I love that part of my job. And then you just heard about mentoring. So I um, am faculty director for a MSTP Summer Scholars Program, which is for undergraduates who are interested in the MSTP pathway, who are either from underrepresented backgrounds or at institutions that don't have, as many research opportunities to be able to come here to University of Wisconsin to do a summer research opportunity where we also do a variety of other activities. And I just love that. And I think I was myself did many summer programs when I was in undergrad and even back into high school. And I appreciate that I'm able to give back now. So I love that.
I think ditto across the board here. Mentoring trainees in the lab, I think is super fun. One sort of example is a student that came in as a postbac that, was claimed to be interested in the combined degree program, but like, you can kind of tell, right? Like usually you're like, oh, okay, like you're here to check the box, or at least that's what I thought initially. But like at the 6-month mark, he turned it on, and it was so cool to see it, where like, I would ask him, all right, so what are you doing? What's the next set of experiments? And whereas early on it would be blank stares, by the 6-month mark, he was like mapping out the next like 3 or 4 days worth of experiments and what to do based on a particular result that could occur. Super gratifying. Now he's a PhD student in my lab, right? So like completely, blew me out of the water when it came to that. So that's one of the most fun things. And then obviously on the clinical side, just the patient interaction and that sort of the one-on-one when you're interacting with patients who are incredibly vulnerable, and you're meeting them at a very unfortunate time usually, but you can try to sort of usher them through that. So it's not as bad as maybe it otherwise could be.
Thank you so much. That was great. And how did your research focus evolve throughout your career? And did you end up staying in the one field that you did your PhD in, or did you change it?
Oh, I guess I can start there. Well, I'll say most MD PhDs don't do the research that they do during MD PhD training or the clinical field that they may have gone into it thinking. So I caution students, don't worry so much about trying to plan everything out on day one of medical school and graduate school, because you often won't exactly know what you want to do, and that's okay, because a lot of the techniques and what you learn during your graduate training, you can apply to many different disciplines. And so as long as you have a strong foundation in actually how to do research, that's more important than actually what research you were doing. And I think that's kind of a misconception of students as they enter these programs. So the how is much more important than the what. That being said, my research and my clinical interests have matched all the way throughout my training, but that's like highly unusual. I just happened to be one of these early differentiated people. So in undergrad, I was a neuroscience major. I did cancer research in a couple of summers. I did neuroscience research in a couple of summers. And then I got my degree in biomedical neuroscience working on brain tumor metabolism. And that I then became a neuro-oncologist and I work on brain tumor metabolism. But most of the time it doesn't match like that. And don't stress yourself out about it, because it's very difficult to predict what your interests are. And when you go to your clinical clerkships in medical school, you could go in thinking, oh, I want to do one thing, but then you actually see the day to day and what a surgeon does or what an OB-GYN does and what a dermatologist does, and it just doesn't mesh with you. And that's okay, because you can switch your clinical interests and you can apply your research principles to whatever specialty you choose. It's just important to do it right the first time and learn the techniques so that you're a really strong candidate for whatever career you want to go into after you finish dual degree training.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier that what I did for my PhD and what I'm doing now is quite different, but I don't regret anything, and the skills that I learned are really important. And I think that is pretty common, like you've just heard. In terms of specialty, I was pretty sure I wanted to do neurology because it kind of related to the research that I was doing at the time. But I was one of those people, when I went on my clinical clerkships, I loved everything. And then in the end had to really think, like, well, what am I going to do? I like everything. How do I decide? And ultimately, went with my original, which was neurology. And I've been very happy about that. But then the subspecialty that I went into initially, I thought I was going to do a different neurology subspecialty. But when I got into residency and, kind of went through some of my rotations, I realized that I was much more drawn to epilepsy and some of the research questions there. And, it was still early enough within my residency that it was no problem to switch gears. And so I think just kind of keeping an open mind as you go along, not to be too unfocused, but to allow yourself to, just keeping an open mind to different opportunities and different things, I think is really important, and not get too narrow in your thinking of your pathway.
I guess like I've been kind of doing the same thing, more or less. I was bioengineering chemistry initially, so I wanted to apply this. So basically, I wanted to synthesize a drug, test it in the lab, in vitro, and then in cells, and then test the thing in animal models. And that's what I did during my PhD in cancer pharmacology PhD. And we actually used proteins or polymers that were targeted to tumors to deliver cytotoxic radioisotopes, alpha particle emitters. So I did that, as like I said, as a grad student, and I do that now. I wasn't planning on continuing doing it, but it turned out that still interested in it, and we expanded a little bit beyond that. But fundamentally, it's very much the same. One advantage that I've found is that I've been in the field for 15 years, even though I just started my faculty position, a few years ago. So it is helpful because you kind of know all the major players. So that's been beneficial on that end. Yeah.
That really is great to know that even with you guys all being in different careers sort of in this one career, you're able to do so much, and you're not limited by just whatever you major in or whatever you choose to study when you're younger. But yeah. And then what are the job prospects of a physician scientist, and where did you find that most of your colleagues ended up? And Dr. Scorsha, if you'd like to start us off, you can.
We're all over the place, right? I mean, it sort of depends on what your specialty is. And that'll be the thing that probably drives, most things, unless you're exclusively lab. So if you're not seeing patients or you don't have any clinical practice, and some of us chose that. But the ones that are going to be seeing patients and trying to run a lab in sort of an academic center, the specialty kind of drives it. And so whether or not the specialty themselves support the research side, it's expensive to support you, right? You need money to run a lab. You need the money to be able to have the supplies and money to pay people to come do the work, right? And beyond that, if you think about it, you bring in money as a physician, right? So you're not seeing as many patients as your colleagues who are full-time clinicians. So these are considerations, the financial considerations that department chairs have to sort of take into account. But we're all over the place. My class is kind of split all across the board. Some folks are mostly focusing on clinical. Private practice is what they do. They see patients. That's where their sort of passion lies. Not really involved in the research side. You have other folks that are mostly clinical and academics and doing some research, more skewing clinical research. Other folks are running their own groups. Some folks are, dry labs, so computational things like that. It's all over the place, right? And some people went into venture capital, right? So it's all over the place. The training is very versatile. It teaches, PhD is a degree in how to think and tackle problems, right? So I think you can definitely apply that across multiple domains. And MDs, and that's a very unique skill set that not everybody gets exposure to. So it comes in high demand in other specialties, rather in other fields when you bring that to the table. So it's all over the place.
Agree. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, because we've done some of these sessions for APSA in the past, alternative career paths. You have FDA, CDC, consulting, obviously industry, private practice, other regulatory agencies. So I think you should think broadly, because academia is not for everyone, and there's a lot of strong things to be said about other career paths. And that switch to a different career path after a dual degree can either happen immediately after the dual degree or after residency. And that's a very big decision to make as well, because for some of those paths, having clinical expertise is not required, or actually having the ability to prescribe medications and be licensed, let's say, meaning the basic medical knowledge you get in medical school is enough. But for others, you may either want to have the ability to understand issues pertinent to patients, which you really only get as a resident, or the ability to be a practicing clinician, which really you also only get from being a resident, because you sort of can't practice medicine unless you have like basic internship in general. So those are considerations that a lot of people often ask about. They don't want to be a practicing clinician later on in life. Should they still do a residency? And I think there's valid arguments on both sides of that for doing residency or not.
All right, sweet. Thank you. And we have we have time for just one more question. So what do you think, or what would you say kept you motivated during the long training process? And what advice do you have for the applicants?
All right, I can go first here. I think I saw a lot of those questions. Just take it one stage at a time. Okay, it's very overwhelming to think when you're, let's say, 21, 22, finishing undergrad, that you might have like 15 years ahead of you until you're like an assistant professor or instructor. Don't think that way. That's not going to help anyone. Think, I'm going to apply to a medical school. I'm going to apply to a dual degree or another type of program. And 1 year at a time, you get in, you get your feet wet. All right, it's my cuckoo clock. So think one step at a time. I think that's one way not to get overwhelmed. And in terms of motivation, I think you have to really enjoy the path. Like you can't say like, oh, I'm going through this because I'm going to be happy in the end. It's not like an ends justify the means. You have to enjoy the means. And so you have to enjoy like first of all, being a student. So you have to be someone who like really yearns for learning and enjoys that process, because you're going to be in school for a long time. So if you don't like being a student, not the path for you, right? If you want to be a leader and you're someone who likes to be on top, it's going to take you a long time to get there. And if you're not comfortable being a junior person who receives orders or receives directives or is training under a mentor, and you're someone who's like kind of more of a free spirit, that's not going to be a great path for you. So I think you have to enjoy the path. You have to take pride in that, and also the achievements that you're gonna take. You have to be someone who likes deferred rewards, right? Because things take a long time. It takes a long time to get a paper. It takes a long time to get a good result. It takes a long time to learn everything you need over the course. And so I think I would use that as motivation.
I agree, and I won't reiterate what was already stated, but just add that having good support network helps. So I have really close friends still to this day from actually each phase. So I have a group of friends from med school, a group of friends from PhD, and a group of friends from the MSTP. And there's some overlap in there, but not completely. And those groups of friends kind of like, we went through this together, and we got we had fun, we did fun things, social things, and also supported each other through the ups and downs that are going to happen. It's not all roses every day during any phase of the training, and you need, I feel like, having just a good support network of people that are going to cheer you on, and I mean, like, just being transparent, like, coming from like a underrepresented background, there were things that were hard about it. So like my dad would always be like, when are you going to be done with school? When are you going to be done with school? Like, he was not of the mindset of somebody going to school for so long. And I don't know if he ever, he was super proud of me, but I don't know if he ever quite got like, what exactly I was doing, and that's okay. That's okay too. But he sure was there on graduation day, like cheering me on. And so I think that, that to say that, like, people around you may not always understand what you're doing, but as long as you know that this is the right path for you, and you're kind of going to persevere through it, I think that's what's really important.
Yeah, I mean, you got to enjoy the ride. I mean, if you don't like being in the lab or doing the research side, that's going to be a brutal 4 or 5 years, right? You got to enjoy some aspects of it. Nothing is perfect the entire way through. There's going to be some ups and downs no matter what. You got to find your people, right? Like, that's how you sort of commiserate, you break bread, you sort of exchange your experiences, and you may learn from each other. Somebody may have figured out something that you wouldn't have otherwise known about, or maybe you would have figured out eventually, but they already did it, right? So you compare notes and you sort of help each other out. And finding that cohort makes it a lot easier. In fact, I'm incredibly lucky because three, so that's four. Well, if you count the PhD people, I live like within 15 minutes of a bunch of my colleagues. Three of us were MD PhDs. Two of us did MD PhDs in the same lab, right? He lives down the road. I can like walk to his house. It's like takes me 20 minutes, right? It's dumb. That never happens. I mean, we can talk to all colleagues. It just never happens. But these are the folks that were my friends at the time, and they're still my friends. They have kids now. Our kids play together, which is a mind job. It's the people, right? So you got to find the right mentors to, like, when you're in the lab, you got to find the right people who are mentors on the clinical side. See where people who are ahead and like, yo, how'd you do this, right? You need that guidance. But like Evan said, you can't just take the entire 15-year arc and be like, oh, okay, how am I going to get over there? 15 years is a long time, and it's incremental. Each year you get a little closer to that. You have the tools that you need to be successful at that stage. So, ask yourself, like, do I like this? Could I do this for the next sort of phase, rather than trying to take a big bite of the entire, multi-year affair?
Alrighty, so thank you guys. That is about time. And I just want to say thank you all for joining us for our Q&A session today with our current students. I want to send a big thank you to our panelists for their time, to the participants who made this session interactive, and to so many people that put these sessions together, including the APSA Diversity Ad Hoc, PR, JEDI Partnership Committees, Gabby, and APSA Leadership. This session is recorded and will be on our YouTube page, and we are currently in the process of planning our calendar for our upcoming interactive sessions. Stay tuned via social media and look out for emails. I hope you guys have a great evening. Thank you guys so much again. Okay, bye. Have a nice day.
Thanks.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.